Top focus at this hour, Mexico. It is witnessing a wave of violence in various parts of the country after the army killed a major drug cartel leader.
Nemesio Osguera, also known as El Mencho, was killed in an operation in Jalisco state. 59-year-old Osguera was the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The army said that he was wounded in a clash with soldiers in the town of Tapalpa and died while being flown to Mexico City. He had a bounty of $15 million on his head.
There is a small town in western Mexico called Aguililla in the state of Michoacan. If you have never heard of it, that is not surprising. It is the kind of place the rest of the world forgets about. Dusty roads, avocado farms, and families doing everything they can just to survive another day. It was here, on July 17, 1966, that a boy named Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born into that forgotten world. Nobody looked at that baby and saw a future drug lord. His parents were working-class people. His neighborhood was poor. The opportunities around him were almost non-existent. And so, like many children in that part of Mexico, Nemesio dropped out of primary school early. Not because he was lazy, not because he did not care, but because poverty does not wait for anyone to finish their education. Life demanded more from him than a classroom could offer. Now think about that for a moment. A young boy, growing up with nothing, watching the world move around him while he stands still. No diploma, no connections, no clear future. That is the soil that planted the seed of everything that came after. By the time the 1980s arrived, Nemesio was a young man with hungry eyes and empty pockets. He made a decision that thousands of Mexicans have made before him and after him. He crossed illegally into the United States. He settled in California, working odd jobs, trying to survive in a country that did not want him there legally. But surviving on odd jobs was slow. And the streets of California in the 1980s were full of faster money, if you were willing to take the risk. He took the risk. He got involved in the heroin trade. And in 1986, just like that, his name appeared on a police report for the first time. Arrested in San Francisco on drug-related charges. That arrest was just the beginning. More arrests followed over the next few years, each one tied to narcotics, each one adding another page to a criminal file that was quietly growing thicker. Eventually, he served time in an American prison. And when that sentence was done, the United States sent him back to where he came from. Deported to Mexico in the early 1990s, returning home with nothing but a criminal record and a closed door behind him. Most people, when they hit that kind of wall, try to find another way. And for a brief moment, it seemed like Nemesio might do just that. He actually worked as a local police officer for a short time after his return. Let that sink in. The man who would one day become Mexico's most wanted criminal once wore a badge. But the pull of the criminal world was stronger than any badge could hold. By the late 1990s, he had walked back into the darkness, this time with his eyes wide open. When Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes re-entered the world of organized crime in the late 1990s, he did not start at the top. He started where most people start, at the bottom, working his way into existing networks. He connected with the Milenio Cartel and a powerful affiliated group called Los Queenies, both of which controlled major drug operations across western Mexico at the time. He learned, he watched, he waited. And then, between 2007 and 2010, the perfect storm arrived. Mexican authorities and rival cartels were fighting each other fiercely. Major cartel leaders were being arrested or killed. The criminal underworld was bleeding and broken in many places, leaving gaps, leaving territories without owners, leaving power up for grabs. Most men in that world would have stayed low, stayed safe, stayed hidden. Nemesio did the opposite. He made his move. Together with a small group of trusted associates, he founded the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CGNG. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Even the name told you everything you needed to know. This was not going to be like the old cartels. This was something new, something hungrier, something far more dangerous. From the very beginning, CGNG operated differently. Other cartels ruled through tradition and old alliances. El Mencho, because that is what the world now called him, built his cartel like an army. Fighters were trained and disciplined. Movements were coordinated. Weapons were not just pistols and rifles anymore. CJNG started using drones for surveillance. They used improvised explosive devices. They drove fortified vehicles that could withstand military-grade firepower. These were tactics borrowed from warfare, not street crime. The money coming in was enormous. CJNG trafficked cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl. Billions of dollars worth of poison flooding across borders, reaching the streets of the United States and beyond. The fentanyl trade alone was devastating. Thousands of people in North America were dying from overdoses, and CJNG was one of the organizations feeding that crisis, shipment by shipment. But El Mencho did not only rule through drugs. CJNG ran extortion operations, forcing businesses and ordinary people to pay protection money or face violence. They kidnapped for ransom. They stole fuel from government pipelines. They laundered their money through banks, shell companies, and eventually through cryptocurrency, always finding smarter, harder to trace ways to hide their wealth. And then in 2015, the entire world understood just how powerful CJNG had become. During a military operation in Jalisco, CJNG fighters shot down a Mexican army helicopter. A military helicopter. Not a police car. Not a government building. A helicopter carrying soldiers brought down by a cartel. The images shocked Mexico. They shocked the international community. Because shooting down a military aircraft is not the act of a criminal gang. It is the act of an organization that believes it can fight a government and win. El Mencho had built a monster. And the monster was just getting started. By the time the 2020s arrived, El Mencho was not just a name on a wanted list. He was a legend. Not the kind of legend people celebrate, the kind people fear. The kind that makes entire communities go quiet when his name is spoken out loud. The United States government placed him at the very top of the DEA's most wanted list. The State Department put a $15 million reward on his head, $15 million for anyone who could provide information that led to his capture. That is not a small number. That is the kind of money that changes families, changes lives, changes futures. And yet, year after year, the tip that would break the case never came. CJNG, under El Mencho's direction, had by this point grown into something almost unimaginable. The cartel was not just operating in Mexico anymore. It had networks running across the United States, into Europe, into Asia, into Africa. A criminal organization born in rural Jalisco had become a global enterprise, moving drugs, money, and violence across continents. All of it connected back to one man who nobody could find. Because El Mencho had become a ghost. Intelligence reports described him rotating constantly between safe houses in Jalisco, Michoacan, Nayarit, and Colima. He moved without patterns. He trusted almost nobody. He was surrounded at all times by heavily armed bodyguards, men with military training who had pledged their lives to keeping him alive and free. Investigators from multiple countries were sharing intelligence, tracking leads, following threads. And every thread seemed to end in silence. The Mexican government launched operations. American agencies provided surveillance support. Sanctions were placed on CJNG's financial infrastructure, freezing assets, targeting the money flows that kept the machine running. None of it was enough to find the man at the center. Think about what that says. The combined resources of the Mexican federal government, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, and international intelligence networks, all focused on a single man from a small town in Michoacan, and he was still out there, still giving orders, still running an empire. For years. Meanwhile, ordinary Mexicans were living under the shadow of everything El Mencho had built. Communities in cartel-controlled territories lived in fear. Businesses paid extortion fees or burned. Journalists who reported too closely on CJNG disappeared. Local officials who refused to cooperate were threatened and sometimes killed. The cartel had inserted itself into the fabric of daily life in ways that law enforcement struggled to unpick. And El Mencho? He remained invisible. A name whispered in fear. A face on a wanted poster that never seemed to translate into a real arrest. The years passed. The rewards stayed unclaimed. The hunt continued. And somewhere in the mountains and forests of western Mexico, the ghost of Aguililla kept breathing. Until February 2026. It was not a dramatic intelligence breakthrough that finally unraveled El Mencho. It was something much more human than that. It was love, or at least the kind of closeness that comes with trust. And trust, in the world of organized crime, is always the most dangerous vulnerability. Federal intelligence agencies, working alongside their American counterparts, began monitoring a woman named Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. She was one of El Mencho's romantic partners, someone close enough to him that she moved in the same orbit, visited the same places, traveled toward the same safe locations. Investigators watched her carefully, patiently, and her movements led them somewhere they had been trying to reach for years. A rural compound near Tapalpa, in the state of Jalisco. In the early hours of February 22, 2026, everything converged on that location. Mexican Army units, National Guard personnel, Air Force assets circling above. Special Forces teams trained for exactly this kind of operation. All of them moving at once, coordinated, quiet, closing in from multiple directions before anyone inside could react or escape. But CJNG fighters inside the compound did not surrender. These were not ordinary guards. These were trained soldiers of a cartel that had spent years preparing for confrontations with the Mexican military. They responded immediately with high-powered weapons, rocket launchers, fortified vehicles. The firefight that broke out was not a brief exchange of gunfire. It was a battle. And in the middle of that battle, El Mencho ran. He fled into the woods surrounding the compound, moving fast, bodyguards beside him, hoping the darkness and the trees would give him what they had always given him, invisibility. But this time was different. Security forces tracked him into the forest. And in those woods, wounded and cornered, the ghost of Aguililla finally ran out of shadows to hide in. He was found, wounded, with two close associates beside him. They pulled him out of those trees and began transporting him toward Mexico City for medical treatment. He did not make it. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, died en route. The news spread across Mexico in hours, and the reaction was immediate. Within hours of the announcement, CGNG launched coordinated attacks across at least 8 Mexican states. Vehicles were set on fire and used to block roads. Businesses were torched. Public infrastructure was targeted. Armed cartel members openly confronted security forces in cities and towns across western and central Mexico. Guadalajara shook. Puerto Vallarta, a city millions of tourists visit every year, issued warnings for people to stay indoors. Flights were canceled. Transport routes shut down completely. The man was dead, but the machine he built was still running, furious, violent, and determined to make the world feel his absence. When a man like El Mencho dies, the world expects things to get better. The most wanted criminal in Mexico is gone. The cartel he built should crumble. The violence should slow down. The communities that lived under his shadow should finally breathe. But that is not how it works. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the life and death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The Mexican government deployed additional troops across the country to contain the violence that erupted after his death. International advisories were issued. The chaos that followed the announcement of his killing lasted days and left casualties on both sides, law enforcement and cartel fighters. The tourist economy in regions like Puerto Vallarta took an immediate hit as travelers canceled plans and governments warned their citizens away. Inside CJNG, analysts predicted exactly what you would expect when a powerful leader dies without a clear successor: fragmentation and internal power struggles. Different commanders, each controlling different territories and operations, would begin competing for the top position. In the cartel world, that competition is rarely peaceful. It usually means more bodies, more violence, more communities caught in the middle of a war they never asked to be part of. The financial systems El Mencho had constructed continued operating after his death. Investigators found that cryptocurrency wallets connected to the cartel were still active, still moving money. The money laundering networks that had been built over years through banks, shell companies, and digital currency did not switch off because the man who built them was gone. The machine had its own momentum now. And so the harder question remains. The question that goes beyond El Mencho as an individual and reaches into something deeper. What does it actually take to stop organizations like CJNG? Is it enough to find the man at the top and remove him? History suggests the answer is no. Cartels have lost leaders before, major ones, famous ones, and the organizations have survived, adapted, and in some cases grown stronger in the chaos that followed. The roots of what El Mencho built go all the way back to that dusty town in Michoacan. Back to poverty. Back to a boy who dropped out of school because his family could not afford for him to stay. Back to a young man who crossed a border illegally because there was nothing waiting for him at home. That is not an excuse for the violence he caused, the lives he destroyed, and the communities he held hostage for decades. There is no excuse for any of that. But it is the truth. And the truth matters, because until the conditions that produce men like El Mencho are addressed, poverty, lack of opportunity, institutional corruption, and the global demand for drugs, the story does not end with one man's death in the forests of Jalisco. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born in Aguililla and died in the woods near Tapalpa. He built an empire that stretched across continents and left devastation in its wake. He was found, finally, because of the person closest to him. His story is over. The story itself is not. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, hit that like button, and turn on notifications for more crimes videos.